Because if you write a book about feedback, as I did, you're going to get a lot of it. And so I want to share with you some of the most important feedback that I got about radical candor. One bit of feedback was that very often people confuse radical candor and obnoxious aggression. Someone will charge into a conference room and say, "In the spirit of radical candor," and then proceed to act like a garden variety jerk. And that is not the spirit of radical candor, that's the spirit of obnoxious aggression. So if that is happening in your organization, call it compassionate candor. In the second edition, I offer a nuanced change to the 2x2. Now, the other thing that happened just after the book was published. I was giving a radical candor talk at a tech company in San Francisco, and the CEO of that company had been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade. She's a person who I like and respect enormously, and one of too few black women CEOs in tech or in any other sector, frankly. And when I was finished giving the presentation, she pulled me aside and she said, "Kim, I'm really excited to roll radical candor out on the team. I think it's going to build the kind of innovative culture that I want here. But I got to tell you, Kim, it's much harder for me to roll it out than it is for you." And she went on to explain to me that as soon as she would offer anyone even the most compassionate, gentle criticism, she would get slimed with the angry black woman stereotype. And I knew this was true. And as soon as she said it to me, I had 4 revelations at the same time. The first was that I had failed to be the kind of colleague that I imagined myself to be, that I aspired to be. I had failed even to notice the extent to which she had to show up at every single meeting we were ever in together, unfailingly cheerful and pleasant, even though she had what to be pissed off about in that period of time, as we all do. And it just hadn't occurred to me the toll that must take on her. And it should have if I wanted to be a good colleague. The second thing that I realized was that as a woman in the workplace, I had been in denial about a whole host of things that were happening to me throughout my career. Kind of hard thing for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit. But I had pretended a bunch of stuff wasn't happening that was because I never wanted to think of myself as a victim. The next thing that I realized was that even deeper in denial than I was about sort of being on the receiving end of some stuff, I was most deeply in denial about the times when I had said or done things that harmed my colleagues, that were unfair. And you can't, as my son's baseball coach says, you can't do right if you don't know what you're doing wrong. So I needed to come to grips with that. And last but not least, I realized as a leader, I had not created the kind of environment in which everyone could just get shit done without having all this other stuff distract them. And so I started thinking about my friend's story and what was going on with her. Was it bias? Was she experiencing prejudice? Was she experiencing bullying? And as I thought about it, I realized that very often bias, prejudice, and bullying masquerade as feedback. And that I needed to write a whole other book to deal with this problem, and that's called Just Work. So bias, prejudice, and bullying are not legitimate feedback. This is not helpful feedback. But what are these things? The next thing I realized is that we often conflate them as though they're the same thing, but they're actually 3 different things. Bias is not meaning it. It's just kind of a brain hiccup. It's unconscious. Prejudice, however, is meaning it. It's a very consciously held belief, usually reflecting some kind of stereotype. And bullying, there's no belief, conscious or unconscious, at all going on there. It's just being mean. So there's a lot more to say about each of these topics. But for me, it's really useful to have some super simple definitions so that in the moment I can know how to react. However, just having definitions doesn't tell me what to say, and it is really hard to know what to say. So here are some ways to think about what to say when you don't know what to say. One of my favorite stories about bias comes from Aileen Lee, who started Cowboy VC. She tells a story about going into a meeting with 2 colleagues who are men, sitting down at a table, and then the other side, they were negotiating a big deal at a big, long conference table. And people from the other side filed into the room. The first guy comes in and sits across from the man to Aileen's left. The next person comes in, sits across from the guy to his left, and then everybody else files on down the table, leaving Aileen dangling by herself. That's often how bias shows up, just who we choose to sit across from. Aileen had the expertise that was going to win her team the deal. So she started talking, and when the other side had questions, they started directing them at her two colleagues who are men. Anybody ever seen this happen? It happened once, it happened twice, and then the third time it happened, her colleague stood up and said, "I think Aileen and I should switch seats." And they did, and the whole dynamic in the room changed. So that's an I statement. An I statement sort of invites everyone else in to understand things from your perspective. And he did that for a couple of reasons. He did that, for one reason, he liked Aileen, and he didn't like seeing her get ignored, but he also did it because he just wanted to win the deal, and he knew that if he couldn't get them listening to Aileen, they wouldn't win the deal. So there's kind of a relational aspect to this, because you care about people, and there's also a practical side to this. So an I statement just kind of holds a mirror up. It doesn't call people out and invite someone in. But holding a mirror up is not going to work if it's prejudice, because the person's going to smile in the mirror. They're going to like what they see. So what do you do? What do you do in the case of prejudice? Here you need an it statement. Another colleague of mine, a veteran, Trier Bryant, told me a story about being in a hiring meeting. So they had interviewed about 6 different candidates, and everyone on the hiring committee agreed that the most qualified candidate was a black woman who wore her hair out naturally. But the hiring manager said, "Oh, we can't extend an offer to that candidate." Trier said, "Why in the world not?" And the hiring manager said, "I'm not going to put that hair in front of the business." Now, believe me, nowhere on the rec did it say anything about people's hair. So what is an it statement, and what could an it statement look like in this situation? It is illegal not to hire someone because of their hair, which it was in that state. It is an HR violation not to hire someone because of their hair, which it was at that company. Or if you don't have the law or the HR policy on your side, you can simply appeal to common sense. It is ridiculous not to hire the most qualified person because of their hair. So an it statement just sort of shows where that line is between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they cannot impose those beliefs on others. Now, last but not least, bullying. When you respond to bullying, you don't want an I statement, which brings the person closer. You don't want the bully closer to you. And you also don't want to show a bully where the boundary is, because you can be sure they're going to try to kick right past it. I learned a little bit about responding to bullying from my son when he was in 3rd grade. He was getting bullied on the playground, and I was encouraging him, as adults do all the time, to use an I statement. "I feel sad when you blah, 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 blah." And he banged his fist on the table, and he said, "Mom, they are trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell them they succeeded?" And I was like, you know what? That's a really good point. So in the case of bullying, you want a you statement. You can't talk to me like that. It pushes them away a little bit. Or if that seems like it might escalate things a little bit, a you question. What's going on for you here? Like, this isn't how you usually behave. Or if it is, and you're worried about escalation, you can also just use a you statement or question to change the subject. "Where did you get that shirt?" The point here is that now that person is answering your questions. You're no longer in a submissive role, you're in an active role. So that is a you statement. Now, let's go back to that story with Aileen Lee, where her colleague said, "I think Aileen and I ought to change seats." That kind of thing almost never happens, because it's really hard to know what to say in those moments. And it's really important for everyone to say something. And it's also important, one of the reasons why I wrote Just Work is in honor of all the upstanders in my career who helped me succeed when I was the target of this kind of behavior. So what can you do? What can you do when you go back to work to make it more likely that someone will say something? I think in the case of bias, what you can do, it's better if your leader rolls this out, but you don't have to be leading the team to propose this idea. It's good to have bias, to have a system for disrupting bias. You need to agree as a team to disrupt it in the moment, because when you're silent about bias, you actually reinforce it. And think about this. This is not working? Okay, this is working. Now I have two things to hold. So think about disrupting bias in the moment, because if you don't disrupt bias in the moment, you reinforce it. This is not criticism. I usually say praise in public, criticize in private. This is just a correction, and corrections can happen in public. However, if it's prejudice, you need to have an agreement, a shared agreement as a team about where that line is, because it's kind of hard to define. It's easy to say there's a line between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they can't impose it on other people. But where is that line for your team? And in the case of bullying, there must be consequences. There must be consequences, because if you allow bullying, then it's just going to escalate. So there need to be conversational consequences. You need to deplatform the bully. You need to figure out how to get them to shut up in the meeting. There need to be compensation consequences. You can't give high ratings, or you can, but if you give high ratings to people who bully others, who get good results by bullying others, then you're rewarding that behavior. You're ensuring there's more of it. And you also are rewarding a local maximum, but hurting the whole team. Because when one person is getting their results by bullying others, it hurts everybody else's work, and collectively it does more harm than good. And last but not least, there need to be career consequences. You don't want to promote that brilliant jerk on your team, because when you do, you destroy your team's culture. And if the behavior doesn't, if you give feedback and the behavior doesn't change, you ultimately need to fire the people who are indulging in bullying. In the immortal words of Steve Jobs, it's better to have a hole than an asshole. All right. But I'm not going to end on that note. We all know how that feels. So let's go a little bit deeper on bias disruptors. What is a bias disruptor? How can we disrupt it in the moment? There's basically 3 simple steps. If you sit down with your team and you agree, we want to disrupt bias before it disrupts our ability to work well together, what can you do? The first step is really to come up with a shared vocabulary. There's no magic words, but what are the words that your team will use and will agree to use when you want to disrupt bias in the moment? So you don't have to think of what to say when you don't know what to say. I like to use a purple flag. I usually bring a purple flag. It blew away in the hurricane, my prop. But other teams that I've worked with had one team just said, yo. So as soon as someone said yo, they knew that someone else had done, or maybe they were disrupting their own bias, but bias was present. Another team that I worked with would throw up a peace sign. And that meant, I noticed something biased happen, and let's disrupt it and move on, move past it. The key thing here is you want to talk to your team, and you want to use the words that they will agree to use. One team used ouch, and then the other person could say oops. So the idea here is that it's fast, that you can point it out and move on past it. You also need to work, though, with everyone to create a shared norm of how to respond when it's you whose bias has been disrupted. Because we all have our biases, and we're all going to have a turn having our bias pointed out at us. And this is hard. I don't know about you, but when someone points out to me that I've said or done something biased, I feel deeply ashamed. I can tell you where in my body I feel it. I feel a tingling in the backs of my knees. It's the same sensation that I get if my children walk too close to the edge of a precipice. It's a real feeling of physical fear. And when we have that sensation, when we feel ashamed, we go into our fight or flight mode. We go into our lizard brains. And it's really hard to respond at your best when you're in lizard brain. But the only way out of shame is through it. So work with people to learn how to just say thank you for pointing it out, and then basically one of two things next. Either I get it, I'll work on not doing it again, or I don't get it. Now, this second thing is really hard because sometimes people will point out to me that I said or did something biased, and I don't even know what I did wrong. And now I'm doubly ashamed. I'm ashamed because I hurt someone, and I'm ashamed because I'm ignorant. So, and yet we all, I promise you, everyone in this room has had that experience at least once in the last week. So let's learn how to just say, it's okay that I didn't know, but I'm open to being educated. So that's a shared norm. And last but not least, you need a shared commitment. You need to embrace the discomfort. Because if you get to the end of a meeting and no bias has been pointed out at you in the meeting, then it doesn't mean that there was no bias in the meeting. It probably means that either people didn't notice and they need to learn to notice, or that they were afraid to point it out. So if you get to the end of the meeting, there have been no bias disruption, give an extra beat. I'm not talking about 10 minutes at the end of every meeting. I'm talking an extra beat, an extra minute. What did we miss? An extra 30 seconds even, to give people an opportunity to think about what they missed. All right, build stamina. That's why the shared commitment is so important, because we are not used. We have a bad habit of just ignoring this stuff. And it causes problems. It becomes like the elephant in the room that keeps us from getting things done. So it is not the bias disruption that is a distraction. It is the bias that is the distraction. So get rid of it. Don't be distracted. All of us have a role to play. If we go back to that story where I was giving the radical candor talk, sometimes each and every one of you in this room is the person harmed. That's when you get to choose whether or not you're going to respond. Other times, each and every one of you in this room will be in the role of the upstander. There, you don't want to be the silent bystander. You want to say or do something to intervene, even if it's just pulling the person aside later and saying, gosh, I noticed that. One time I was on stage, and the leader of this organization was introducing me and a colleague. He introduced my colleague, who was a man, shook his hand, and then he introduced me, and he grabbed my hand, made this really low bow, and he kissed it. He kind of licked it. It was like one of those terrible moments. It was all I could do. And that was bad. Like, that was a little gross. But what was even worse was that there were like a lot of people in the audience, not a single person came up to me later and said, gosh, that was weird, are you okay? And then I sort of felt gaslit, like, was this only weird to me? So as an upstander, you have a great capacity to fix these things, even if it's only just pulling the person aside later and talking to them. All of us, occasionally are biased, prejudiced, or we bully someone. I tell a lot of stories, and I really do not think that I am a bully, but I have bullied people more often than I like to admit. We all cause harm sometimes. When we're in that role, it's our job to listen to the feedback and to address it. And last but not least, as a leader, it's your job to prevent it. It's your job to prevent it. And this is hard because it's impossible to prevent this stuff from happening. That's why you get paid the big bucks as a leader. At the very least, you want to respond to it when it happens, despite your best efforts, with some kind of response that demonstrates institutional courage that will prevent it from happening again. All right, so I've been talking a lot. I think we have a few minutes for questions.